Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another player ranking of a recently finished season of reality television, and here I'll be doing a player ranking for Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels, where here I'll be running through 24 players of the cast, ranking them, basing them on how I think they played on this season, and with that, let's start it all off at number 24. The person I think played the worst game on this season is Jess, which I think is actually a tough decision here. I do think the bottom two for me are both really bad, but for completely different reasons. Now, I'll say the one pro for Jess is the fact that she obviously survives a tribal where this alliance forms to take out Frankie, though realistically, I feel like that had almost nothing to do with what Jess actively did. I think it was more so a move that saved Jess that kind of just fell into her lap, with her being kind of delusional and thinking that she did actually save herself. And I think it's even more indicative in the fact that she's literally the boot immediately following this, where no one actually really wanted to work with her long term, to where for me that ends up being a major reason why I do have Jess below the next person we'll be talking about, to where while I think the next person we'll be talking about made bigger mistakes in the game, at least they did have a very solid alliance, while Jess is someone that didn't really have allies in the game, with no one really wanting to keep her around. I think in the second round, her trying to turn the vote onto Eden is also a pretty misguided plan as well, to where overall I think Jess's game is pretty mediocre, so she's here at number 24. At number 23, moving on to a player that again I think played an actively worse game, however, at least had a core group of allies, and that person is Peta. And Peta's game is one where it just feels like it's a series of mistakes. I mean, she's someone that creates a very strong minority group to where the majority easily comes together to overpower them. She seems to be someone that ostracizes members of the tribe and doesn't treat the likes of Kelly and Raymond particularly well. She throws the immunity challenge, being too overconfident, her having numbers that she simply didn't have, and then finds an idol only to proceed to not play it, which, I mean, to be fair, I mean, the next person we'll be talking about would have done the same even if they did find it, but again, all those are still massive knocks against Peta here. But again, the reason why she's higher than Jess for me is because at least she had a core group of allies. She had a 4-person alliance that did seem fully loyal to her, and while that alliance ends up being the minority, I mean, I still feel like at least that's something in comparison to Jess, to where Jess simply had a group of people that saved her because they wanted a certain other person out more so than they wanted her to stay, and Peta, again, at least had people that wanted her to stay. Where Peta, for me, again, at least there's something that is decently positive about her that she actively did, unlike Jess. So again, for me, it's enough to put her here at number 23. At number 22, we're moving on to, again, pretty much the Titan version of Peta, and that person is Frankie. And Frankie's actually obviously the first boot of the season, though the reason why I think Frankie is above Peta is because I feel like Frankie does less actively wrong than Peta. Again, I mentioned all those things about Peta. While I feel like Frankie, yes, she does create a minority alliance and was misguided in thinking that they had the numbers, which is obviously still issues why she's this low, but I do feel like she at least had better connections in the game. She's someone that did seem to get along with the V's, to where that becomes a reason why she is targeted in this first round, but it did feel like she had more potential if she were to survive this round. Also, I feel like she didn't do as much of the poor social play that it seems like Peta did, where if Peta, we actively see her treating Kelly and Raymond poorly, while with Frankie, we don't really see that, and a lot of the mistakes of this minority group on the Titan side of things, we see from Nathan's perspective. We see Nathan messing up plans and telling people that they're on the bottom, which, again, like, I think that's enough for me to put Frankie above Peta here, where obviously, like, fundamentally their games are very similar, though I feel like Peta's mistakes are much grander than Frankie's, to where while Frankie is the first boot of the season, I do feel like at the end of the day, I do look at their games pretty similarly, just with Peta's being a bit more flawed. So again, for me, that's enough to put Frankie here at number 22. Now, number 21, we're moving on to a person we just mentioned. We do have Nathan, and Nathan is someone that I actually debated putting lower than Frankie, where Nathan is someone that I think makes more active mistakes than Frankie. He is someone that, again, like we see in a conversation with Eden, mentioned Eden's name last, that made him aware of the fact that he was not particularly high in the pecking order. We see him go to Caroline and talk about dragging her through the game, and again, he makes these comments I think are bad. However, obviously he does survive over Frankie, which is something to note there. And also, to be fair, I think in his boot round, I think he at least showed some awareness there. He seemed to actually pick up on the fact that he's on the bottom, which is better than some of his Titan counterparts, and he obviously survives the Jess vote as well, to where, again, for me, I do feel like that's enough to put him above Frankie, where, again, at the end of the day, I do think he makes more mistakes in the game than Frankie. I do think the fact that he survives a decent chunk longer is enough to put him here at number 21. At number 20, we're moving on to a player that is similarly bad, but at least gets taken out in a more fluky situation. That person is Tobias. And again, Tobias kind of sucks. I do feel like everything we saw of Tobias was not good. Again, him making L signs to the Titans after they won the challenge was bad. His overconfidence on his original tribe, thinking that no matter what, he's safe because he's physically strong, was bad. And him just seemingly not being worried at all, despite him being clearly in the minority during his boot round, was insane. Obviously, he's part of all the mistakes that Peta ends up making as well, and like throwing the challenge and being unaware of their position in the game. But again, the thing that does prop him up against the people we've been talking about so far is the fact that he obviously gets taken out in a very fluky situation where he was not the target during his boot round. However, the votes were split in a way that obviously Kelly flipping led to him going out, which in itself is kind of an unlucky situation, as it wasn't really a split that was necessary. They simply just did it because they thought it would be good TV to have Sarah be a deciding vote. And again, Kelly flipping is just nonsensical to where, like, I don't really fault Tobias that much for how he goes, even though obviously the reason why Kelly flips is because she supposedly thought she couldn't work with Tobias, but also it's like how she thinks she could work with Alex, where again, I do think Tobias is at fault still, but in comparison to what we talked about so far, his vote off is just very fluky. So again, it's enough to put him slightly higher, even though the rest of his game is equally bad. But he's here at number 20. At number 19, moving on to person we just mentioned, we do have Kelly. And Kelly is just such a tough player to assess just because she is possibly on paper one of the worst Survivor players we've ever seen. I mean, she is someone that is completely unstable in the game, someone that you cannot rely on for really anything, and someone that you have to micromanage so much because at the first instance, she'll be willing to flip on you. And mixing now the fact that she's also just an annoying presence at camp and someone that no one particularly liked, it really makes her on paper one of the worst players we've ever seen. However, she does make it decently far into the season. And to be fair, I think part of that is due to her having Kirby in the game. Kirby, a player that is so insane strategically where she's willing to take Kelly that far into the game. But the fact that Kelly even made it to the final vote before the merge is actually kind of insane. And again, in comparison to the people we talked about so far, I mean, like, I felt like fundamentally I have to have her above Tobias, and the fact that she survives over Tobias and is the person to vote out Tobias. Again, that's something at least. Now, again, like, I think if this was a ranking on them as players, she would be lower on the list. I think she's up there with the worst players from this season. Though, again, this is more so an assessment of the games they played on this season. And with that, again, I feel like Kelly surviving as long as she did, and again, having control during the Tobias vote, even though it was a bad move, I think it's enough to put her above Tobias. But again, like, she really spends most of the game being a direct target. Pretty much during the entire pre-swap phase of the game, she just had people wanting to go after her, and is kind of on the edge of her seat throughout most of those rounds. After the swap, she's obviously just ingrained within Kirby's alliance and not really doing much there until she turns against her own alliance and gets taken out immediately following that. Again, it's not a good game at all. But again, I think it's just enough to be above the people we've talked about so far, so that's why she's here number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a player that I think sent a lot of mixed signals. I mean, in a way, there's a lot of the same bad that was there with the likes of Peta and Tobias, though there's also some good, and that person is Sarah. And I mean, like, Shreya, we didn't really get to see much of Sarah's game. I mean, despite the fact that she seemed to be decently positioned on her original tribe, to where despite being on the bottom, she's like the only person that doesn't get talked about as being a target. We didn't really get to see a lot of why that is the case. And I assume it's because she had good social connections, but again, she is someone that, despite, again, Peta going out and then Alex and Tobias getting the vote split on them, we never see Sarah even being in the conversation as someone to go after. So that's something that props her up to at least this spot. And I think after swap, again, it's a bit conflicting, to where while she is on the bottom at that point, again, I think she does do decent work in building a bond with Kitty and Caroline to where they're saved over the likes of Viola, and then she gets taken out in the following round. Obviously, that was an extremely wonky round, one where I think she shows some pros and some cons. Some pros in the fact that she does ultimately flip and is trying to make the move against Caroline and Kitty when she realized she's on the bottom. However, I also criticize her for the fact that it took her so long to realize she was on the bottom and that she should have made that move, to where that's knocked there as well. Though again, at the end of the day, she did technically have the numbers to go to a tie vote. It was Rianna messing up the split vote plan that caused that to go south, and also the Titans like are originally splitting the vote and then stopped splitting the vote to put the votes on her, to where there's enough wonkiness there to where I could definitely make the argument for her being higher on this list. Though I do think, considering the fact that she was still tactically on the bottom of her original tribe, it's enough to put her lower than the next person we'll be talking about, who I think was more properly swap screwed. So because I do have Sarah here at number 18. 18. Now, number 17, we're moving on to a player that also sent conflicting messages. I feel like this person deserved their boot. I think they made the mistake that caused them to be booted, though I think they were unlucky to be in a position where that actually mattered, and that person is Viola. And again, Viola is a person that, again, I think her trying to make the move against Caroline and actively putting in work to make that move, but then not go through with it is bad. And that is a lot of the reason why she goes home. The fact that she makes it so apparent, the fact that she's going after Caroline. However, in most situations, that wouldn't have mattered. Again, I think if the Titans tribe had stuck together, her side would have just outright had the numbers the following round to take out Caroline. And Viola would have been safe long term, having very close allies in the likes of Winna, and the likes of Mark, Valeria, even Winna and Jaden, but because she tried to make the move a bit early and didn't go through with it, and then they swapped into a position where Caroline's side of things had more of the numbers, I think it's, again, a bit unlucky there. And again, she seemed to be a decently well-rounded player outside that. I mean, someone that, again, like had this killer instinct, was willing to make these moves, and only didn't go through with it because Mark told her not to. Someone that seemed decent socially. Seemed like people really liked her out there. Obviously, he's very physical. Like, I feel like Viola is definitely this massive threat in the game. But again, I do think she made that one strategic misstep that really cost her the game. But I think it's, again, the fact that she kind of gets swap screwed to a degree, being swapped with the specific Titans that she does. That does leave her above Sarah for me, who, again, was not in a great position to begin with, where at least Viola was in a very good position on her original tribe. So because that, again, it's enough for me to put her here number 17. Now number 16, we're moving forward quite a bit. We're jumping all the way to a mid-merge boot, and here we do have Alex. And Alex's game is just so turbulent on this season. I mean, he's someone that very rarely ever votes correctly on this season. Someone that is constantly in the minority throughout most of the season. And a lot of that due to his own actions. Again, early on, he obviously plays a really misguided game. Again, being part of Peta's alliance, that gets blindsided right away. He then would have been the boot in episode 4 had it not been for Kelly switching her vote at the last second, which, again, you could partially credit him for building a bond strong enough with Kelly to save him, but also he didn't, and he didn't really try, and it was more so, I guess, Tobias doing more actively wrong than him. But either way, following that, I think he actually does decent work in getting himself within the Ferris alliance, but even then, Ferris didn't seem to fully trust him, where we see him at the merge being left out in numbers. He also gets a very unfortunate swap to where he's on the bottom, but even then does survive a little bit. But to be fair, I think you can credit that to physical strength for a bit, and even then, he probably would have been booted in episode 11 if there wasn't a non-limb. But again, he just seems to be an expendable number at the merge, someone that isn't really looked at as someone that's in any core group. Well, he does flip to join the Titans during a Jaden vote, and that vote does actually go through, partially due to Alex's actions. Again, he is the one to talk to Raymond, where Raymond does tell Alex that he wants to flip, and Alex tells that to Mark. And again, like, there's some work there. He's still very close to being taken out of the game there. Again, would have been a tie had Raymond not flipped. He also would have, in that case, misplayed his idol, playing it for Valeria. And while you could say he got unlucky with Valeria going home in the final 9 round, I also feel like the Valeria outcome was something that was probably very likely to happen anyway. And his boot round is one where, again, the edit is portraying it in a way that it seems like Alex just completely blew up his own game. I'm not sure if that's the actual reality, where while I do think he makes some misguided decisions in that round, I have a feeling that Ferris was always going to vote out Alex. But obviously, like, him going all out at tribal did not really help his case in any way. And again, it's just a game that's a bit all over the place. He doesn't really have a consistent ride through the season. He very rarely even votes anyone out in the season, but he does make it very deep into the season, which is, I guess, enough to put him here at number 16. Now, number 15, we're moving on to a player that I think is pretty similar to Alex, in the sense that this is a person that got really saved by something completely out of their control earlier on in the game, and still had a pretty rocky game after that, though I think this is a person that was at least a bit more in the majority than Alex, and that person is Rianna. And again, Rianna for me is just a very conflicting player on this season, in the fact that she's someone that obviously won a lot of competitions, and someone that was seemingly respected due to those competition wins, while also being a person that got pretty unfortunate in certain situations, though is a player that also played pretty poorly in a lot of situations, or just not actively enough in certain situations, where she does start off the game in a pretty decent position right in the middle of the tribe, though again alongside Kirby ends up playing the middle a bit too much to where they get in a bit of trouble, and mixing that with Kirby's targeting of Ferris, it does lead to Rianna being directly saved by a non-elimination round in episode 5, which is the big knock against her for me, and the reason why she is as low on this list as she is, as again, for someone getting 7th place, this is obviously still a pretty low placement here. And I think that is really, for me, a major knock against her game. The fact that, again, she shouldn't even made it past the 5th round of the game. And it would have been redeemable if the rest of her game was pretty strong, though it simply isn't. It's a situation where, again, she does get swap screwed. She does get swapped away from all of her allies, though at the same time, again, she was still not in a great spot on the original Rebels tribe by that point. On the swap tribe, again, she was someone that was going to be booted right away had it not been for Viola making it a bit too apparent that she was coming for Caroline. Following that, there's also potentially a target at the Sarah boot round had it not been for the Mark plan not being exposed. And while I will give her a bit of credit for building a strong relationship with the likes of Caroline and Kitty, she seemed to buy into that relationship a bit too much, leading to her messing up the tie vote plan, messing up the tie vote at the Sarah boot round, which just puts her on the bottom once again, and is again in this position where she's probably a goner. If they go to tribal in the penultimate round before the merge, it had not been for the fact that she found an idol at the last second, and coming into the merge, again, she's someone that's kind of just in and out of the majority at points where she's working alongside Kirby, but even then, like, not even really voting with her all the time. I mean, her vote against Mark at the win at tribal is pretty insane there. And beyond that, her messing up the Jaden vote and that being the reason why Jaden goes home, all that's not particularly great. She also would have been a target had she not been winning competition. And that ends up saving her in the game at points as well. And just overall, it's not a particularly great game. It's a game where, again, she's in and out with the majority throughout a lot of it. She also was directly saved by non-elimination back in episode 5, to where, again, it makes it tough to really assess her too highly because of those things. To where, while I think there are some pros in her game, particularly her social ability with the likes of Kirby and also Caroline and Kitty, it's simply just not enough to put her much higher on this list than number 15. Now, number 14. Moving on to a player I also don't think of particularly fondly, someone that also made the merge, though someone that I do think at least stayed in the majority throughout most of his run, and that person is Jaden. And Jaden is someone that, again, like Alex, was on the initial minority, was left out of the Frankie vote, though following that, again, I think he does better work ingratiating himself within the majority. Not too fair, I think part of that is due to the fact that he was so nonchalant in playing the game, and him, in essence, not playing the game, and just following around whoever told him what to do, but still, like, he, post-swap, is fully involved in the Rebels' plans and what they're doing. Well, I still think his move to flip on Eden is still pretty dumb. I don't really feel like it gains him really anything. He's still able to recover from that, and him building this bond with Kirby and being ingratiating in Kirby's alliance, where while he's taken out a few rounds later, with him being looked at as a safe vote there, I still think it's very impressive that despite him making this move that has him flipping against half of the players in the game, he's still able to find himself in a majority alliance following that. And I gets taken on a fluky situation where Rianna again messes up the vote and Raymond flips at the last second, to where, again, I think Jaden's game, even though I don't think he particularly played the game well and wasn't really playing the game actively, I think at least does have these major pros to his game, particularly his social game, where at least Jaden was in a majority for most of the season, even though he didn't really do much within it. And because of that, for me, he's here number 14, now number 13. And moving on to a player that I do look at mostly highly, even though this person didn't make it that deep into the season. I do think the way that they did play was pretty impressive, and that person is Garrick. And again, Garrick for me is someone that seemed to have very good reads in the game. He's someone that seemed to be very aware of what was going on around him and correctly called out what people were doing multiple times across the season. Even in his boot round, he was very aware of the fact that he was potentially going home. Now, I do criticize the fact that he very much attached himself to Ferris, to where with Ferris having an idol, he became the very easy safe vote. In that situation, his side was just clearly outplayed by Kirby, but I still think he plays a pretty solid game. Again, like in the pre-swap, he is the majority the entire time. And while, again, he mismanages his relationship with Kirby, to where, again, even though I think Kirby makes bigger mistakes and causing this rift between the two, I think Garrick's reaction to that and making it clear to Kirby that he is upset with her is not great. But again, he's shown to be a pretty major force against Peta. We see him being aware of what the Cuddle crew are doing and still leading the charge against them. We see him being involved in getting the vote to flip against Rianna at the non-elim round, which does seem like it would have gone through. We really just see him, again, being very involved in the strategy of the game, him being alongside Ferris and really being this main advisor to Ferris throughout the game. Again, I think had they not swapped, he would have been in a very good position as original tribe. And even at the swap, even though he does end up losing the battle, I think he at least had good reads in the game, to where, again, at least he was playing the game very actively, and that's something I'll at least give him credit for, to where for me, again, he's enough to be here number 13. Now number 12, a player that's just simply a step above Garrick. Again, survived the round that Garrick went home. And this person has flaws in their own right, and that person is Eileen. And Eileen is someone that I really want to put higher, because I think Eileen is actually a pretty savvy player, someone that did seem to be pretty aware in the game, and someone that did seem to be very strategically minded. Again, another advisor to Ferris, and someone that made it further into the game, made it all the way to the merge, first jury member. Though the reason why I didn't put Eileen higher on this list is because she did get saved by the episode 10 twist. Well, I do think if that had not happened, Eileen just outright goes during that round. I think Ferris plays his idol and Eileen is the boot there. However, I do think she plays the game pretty decently surrounding that. Now, I will say, I do think her campaign to Kirby immediately following that, and her being so desperate, was not a particularly good look. Though, again, I think she, on the original Rebels tribe, she seemed to be playing the middle pretty well, and then after the merge, she seemed to be pretty decently positioned as well, where obviously the criticism there is the fact that she was very clearly coming after Kirby, and even if she wasn't, I do think Ferris even voiced that he was aware of the fact that Eileen was going to be making a move against him, and he would have to make a move against her eventually, where I do think that is something that is probably a knock against Eileen, the fact that she was just kind of openly schemy, and people were aware of the fact that she was going to be making these big moves eventually. But still, I do think Eileen largely came off as a pretty competent player, to where, again, had it not been for the fact that she got saved by a twist in week 10, I personally would have probably had her a bit higher on this list. But I do feel like it is that aspect of it that just makes her just a step above Garrick. Again, just simply surviving one more round than Garrick, while having a similar-ish game outside that, again, being this loyal confidant to Ferris and being his main advisor in the game, though still one that, again, had a somewhat flawed game, which is enough to put her here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving on to the last pre-merger on the list here. A player that, again, I mentioned this in my review. I think this is debatably the most screwed over player in Australian Survivor history, and that person is Charles. And Charles is just a tough player to assess in the fact that the way he goes out is just extremely wonky. I mean, he gets taken out in a situation where the minority all of a sudden just handed the majority vote to take out someone of their choice. And even within that, he's still technically idled out of the game. Now, to be fair, they probably would have voted him out over Winna anyway, but that's not 100% secure. And Charles, again, gets really screwed over in that one tribal. And before that, like, his game is just all around just okay. I mean, he is kind of in the middle of the original Titans tribe, to where he's like one of the big swing votes in that first vote against Frankie, and following that, he's just kind of right in the middle. We really don't see much of him, to where it's tough to really gauge what exactly he was doing. And to be fair, he was not involved in the Middle Age Mafia, which probably not great, but he didn't seem to be in any danger at any point following that. And it also gets swapped into a initially unfortunate position of being outnumbered by the rebels, though is able to become a swing vote through that and become really ingratiated within the Kirby side of things, where again, his game up until his boot round is pretty solid. Now, I do think you still discredit him for being targeted in his boot round, where it seemed to stem from his plan to try to go after Ferris and Eileen at Tribal, which was just kind of a weird plan to begin with. But again, that wouldn't have mattered had it not been for this really unfair twist that really screws him over in the game. So again, I do think Charles is a player that largely got screwed over, which is a major reason why he's a lot higher than some of these other players that made it a lot further than him in the game. And particularly Eileen, in the situation where, again, like, Eileen would have gone home during that vote had it not been for this twist, where Charles in essence outplayed her during that round. So all in all, for me, again, I do think Charles deserved to be somewhat high on this list, so he's here number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a player is one step above Charles. Again, a player that has a somewhat similar game to Charles, though makes it a little bit further than that person is Winna. And again, Winna's game is pretty much on the same caliber as Charles. Now, technically early on, he is not as well ingrained in the majority as Charles, in the sense that he is left out of the Frankie vote, and following that, he is still tied to the likes of Nathan and Jaden, who are on the bottom of the tribe. Though, despite that, again, he does seem to be ingrained within the majority group, to where while that wasn't really on the show, it does seem like from Exit Press, he did have a really good relationship with the likes of Mark and Valeria and Viola, to where he was always pretty safe on that tribe. And again, in comparison to Charles, I think in a position that debatably is better than Charles early on, considering at least he did seem to have closer allies during that portion of the game. And obviously, like Charles, ends up siding with Kirby post a swap, and again is in that situation where they get screwed over by that twist. Now, again, Winna could have potentially gone home during that round had it not been for his idol, though he does still technically survive that round. So I mean, that's something. And beyond that, again, obviously survives a few more votes. He survives the Kelly vote. He proceeds to almost blindside Kitty until Scott ended up quitting the game. That stops that there. there, to where he does survive longer in the game. And I will say, I do think he gets a bit overconfident in the game, and beyond that, he also tried to enact some plans that did not go through, especially with him trying to get the votes onto him, especially with him trying to play his idol correctly. But still, overall, I think Winna plays a pretty solid game on this season, to where, for me, it was enough to put him here at number 10. At number 9, we're moving on to a player that made it relatively deep in the game, though was still another player that I was very conflicted on where to actually land them, and that player is Kitty. And again, for me, Kitty plays a very strange game on this season. The fact that obviously we didn't see a lot of it on the show. Yet despite that, it does seem like she was a pretty decently positioned player for a lot of the early portion of the season, where obviously she is initially part of the middle-aged mafia and works alongside them to blindside the likes of Frankie and taking out Jess and Nathan, obviously working alongside Caroline, while also being a major glue to a lot of their connections in the game, to where it does very much feel like Kitty was this really good social player while out there, to where while she would be a bit aloof strategically at points, she did seem to be the person that was pulling in people to their alliance, where we get talk about how she's closer to Eden than Eden is to Caroline. We get talk about how she's closer to the likes of Rianna and Sarah more than Caroline, to where it does feel like Kitty is this major glue socially for her group. Though obviously strategically she's a bit of a mess. I mean, she's someone that obviously just outright can't lie and gets easily caught every single time she tries to. She is someone that, again, debatably gets potentially saved by the fact that the swap happens when it does, where not they got into another tribal, Kitty definitely would have been in danger. She obviously directly gets saved at the merge, to where Scott ends up quitting the game in a position where Kitty would have been voted out. And that's all pretty negative. And beyond that, even then, her game's not even particularly great. I mean, she is working alongside Caroline for a lot of it, to where, again, they pull off the Winna vote, but after that, they on the out starting to Eden vote, and even then, going along with Eden's plan and targeting Raymond was not particularly good for her game in that position. And even during the later Jaden vote, she actually flips against her own alliance in that situation, only for that vote to not go through, which is pretty insane. And it seems like she burns all trust through that move. So following that, even though she's able to repair her relationship with Caroline, the likes of Mark and Alex simply just don't trust her again following that. And she also becomes an unreliable number to Kirby by the end as well, where it really feels like that kind of blows up her game even more. So our Kitty's game is just a bit of a mess through and through. I mean, it's a game where there's so many holes to pick with her game, though, again, she does make it very deep into the season. And again, in comparison to some of the people we've already talked about that got saved due to very weird situations, Kitty's at least was a bit later in the game than those people, while also seemed to be pretty good socially. So it's like, I think there's just a lot of mixed signals that comes from Kitty's game, to where I had a tough time really landing her on this list, though I did decide to end up landing her here at number 9. Now, number 8, we are moving on to a player that is another one of the tougher players to assess, because this person's game never really properly ended, and that person is Scott. And Scott's someone that obviously quit the game, and because that we never got a natural ending to his game. Yet the game that we did see on the show was actually a pretty impressive one. It's one where he seemed to be in the majority for most of his run. Again, like, he is part of this group that takes out Peta. He then rides the middle and then would have been involved in the Rianna vote off, and then flips over to Kirby to give her power post-swap, to where he remains in the majority through all that. Despite that side getting completely screwed over by the twist in episode 10, he remains completely safe during that round. And really, just in general, he seems to be playing a very strong middle game where just no one is coming after him. So he gets to the merge, being one of the only people to have no votes cast against him throughout the entire season, only for obviously that to be the point where he quits the game. And again, that's kind of what makes it tough to assess his game, because up to that point, I think Scott played one of the best games coming into the merge. And because he quit, it actually, again, leaves these mixed signals, where I think quitting, again, from a gameplay perspective, can give off these two different points of view. Where obviously, because someone quit, you can look at it as they took themselves out of the game, they self-sabotaged their game, and demerit them for that. Though I think you can also praise them in the sense that they didn't naturally leave the game, and that had they not wanted to quit, then they could have potentially still had a deep run. Where again, I think Scott is someone that, again, had he not quit, I think he had a very deep run in him. He is someone that seemed to be very well positioned coming into this merge and would have been a pretty deadly player moving on. Though again, obviously by that point, his head was just not in the game anymore. But I do think the game he played up until that point is still pretty impressive for me, to where good enough to put him here at number 8. Now, number 7, we have another player that goes out due to very wonky circumstances, though their game all around is just kind of a questionable one, and that person is Valeria. And Valeria obviously gets taken out in a weird tribal where technically the only person that votes her out is Raymond. Now, technically also a good chunk of the people left in the game at that point did want to target her anyway, though obviously this Raymond plan went through that ends up sniping her out of the game. Though again, I do think if that round had been a natural vote, I think more than likely Valeria gets at least 4 votes on her, with Kitty being a major swing in that situation, a position where Kitty literally just voted for her the previous round, where again, I don't think it's out of the round possibility. I think Valeria just goes home anyway during that round. But still, beyond that, like, Valeria's game is just kind of okay for a lot of it. I mean, she's kind of in the middle on the Frankie vote, ends up deciding to vote out Frankie in a position where I don't even think that was actually the best move for Valeria at that point, considering it did seem like Frankie was someone that did want to work with Valeria moving forward. But beyond that, I mean, we do see Viola campaigning against Caroline in a position where that was also what Valeria wanted as well, in a position where that blows up Viola's game. So once Viola goes, we see Valeria being gung-ho and wanting revenge for Viola, even though most of the times that she tries to get revenge, it's not even optimal for her game, considering the likes of Caroline and Kitty were actually numbers for her at the merge. Now, I will say navigation-wise, through pre-swap, she does pretty well, obviously attaching herself to Kirby, to where Kirby talks about Valeria being one of her closest allies. Again, that's extremely impressive there, even though she does very poor work in managing certain other relationships with people like Ferris and Eileen and Kelly. So obviously her bluntness at Tribal is something that really gets her in trouble. And again, beyond that post-merge, it's a very sloppy game. It's one where, again, she would have organized this vote against Kitty, so at least there's that, but obviously that doesn't go through due to Scott quit. But then after that, she gets blindsided to win a vote. She then proceeds to almost go to rocks at the Eden vote, which is pretty insane. She does end up being involved in the Eileen vote, and does technically end up being successful in voting out Jaden, though again, that was seemingly due to very little that she actively did, in a position where she was the target for the initial majority during that round. Though, I mean, also you can somewhat credit her for having Alex play the idol on her, though that doesn't really lead to much. And again, I do think her boot round is one where I just don't really even get why no one ended up splitting the vote there. I still think that's pretty insane. Or, to be fair, we did see her have the right instincts in thinking about splitting the vote, and Mark talked her out of it, but I still can't believe not a single person went through with this vote during that. But either way, I mean, like, again, Valeria's game is just very rocky as a whole. Again, a stable early game, even though I think she's making some questionable decisions. A decently strong post-swap game, despite the fact she's making some social missteps, and again, a very sloppy post-merge game, where again, it's not a great game in the grand scheme of things, but I think for this list in particular, I think it's enough to put her here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that I come out of this season being very conflicted on this person's game, where while they were probably the most stable presence somehow throughout a lot of this season, would end up having one of the best voting track records across this entire season. But also a player that didn't seem to have that much gusto in the game, didn't really seem to have this killer instinct that was necessary to win the game, but still made it really far and seemed to be well liked at least, and that person is Raymond. And again, Raymond is just such an enigma on this season. Obviously, we just didn't get to see much of him, sadly. Again, despite how great of a character he seemed to be, we just didn't see much of him on the show yet. The game that he plays on this season, again, is mostly stable. Again, it's one where he's a very close ally to Ferris throughout most of the game. He's working alongside him. He is doing whatever Ferris is doing. And while we do see him having some influence on Ferris at points, particularly in getting rid of Kirby, it doesn't feel like Raymond really does that much on his own outside of the votes where he takes out Jaden, which seemed to be a move just simply to make a move. It didn't seem like he had any real agenda in getting rid of Jaden. It just felt like he needed a move for his resume. And beyond that, obviously, the vote to take out Valeria, though, to be fair, that was something that Ferris ends up getting shared credit for, to where Raymond's game is, again, it's just very strange for me to assess here. Again, he is someone that seemed to be an initial target for the minority, at least, on the original Rebels tribe, to where he ends up being saved over Peta there, and beyond that, ends up becoming a pretty easy person that just put votes on if they're targeting the Ferris side of things, where we see a lot of votes go his way across this season. Though, yeah, another thing to credit him for is his relationship with Kelly, where it seems like that ends up saving him during the Kelly boot round, where she blows up her game for him. But really, a lot of his game is just a worse version of Ferris's game, outside the fact that he technically had a better voting record. Though again, even when he gets taken out 4, he's taken out due to fire making, in a situation where they seem to vote for him in that spot because they're scared of Ferris and fire making, or than them actually wanting Raymond out in that spot, to where, again, there's a lot of wonkiness in his game. It's one where, again, he is largely tied to Ferris. They end up maneuvering through the game together outside of the Jaden vote. And on that, like, he never seemed to be willing to cut Ferris, which I think is a major knock for me in terms of his game. The fact that I do feel like if Raymond wanted to win the game, he really needed to show this killer instinct and being willing to cut Ferris in the game, which he just never seemed to have. And again, that just makes his game very tough to assess. So again, in comparison to the rest of the field, again, he was in the majority for longer than anyone we've talked about so far. He was on the right side of the votes for most of the time he was voting. He has a just solid, consistent track record on this season, which for me, despite him not seeming to be the greatest player in the world, it's enough for him to be here number 6. Now, number 5, we're going pretty far back here. We're the top 6 on this list, and being the top 5 of this season, plus an extra person booted way earlier in the game. And at number 5, we're finally talking about that person. That person is Eden. And Eden is a player that I do think played this season mostly optimally. Again, based on what we were shown, at least. I personally feel like he made the correct strategic call at pretty much every opportunity. Again, we see him be in this very strong spot at the very beginning of the game, again, being part of the Invisible Hand, and then making the middle-aged Mafia, and leading the vote against Frankie, at getting them to blame for it. And then when Jess ends up targeting him the following round, he ends up flipping the vote on Jess, and creates a split vote plan, which, again, I think all that is pretty optimal play. Again, at the swap, we see him again play mostly optimally there, again keeping around Mark as his secondary option for him while attempting to pick up Jaden and going alongside the Caroline and Kitty contingent. And then even in the post merge, to where while he was grouped in with Caroline and Kitty, who are going to be losing that initial merge vote, and he is involved in the win a vote plan, and following that, again, actually gets the Titans to get back together, which I find it very strange how much credit Mark seems to get for this, when we even see on the show itself that after what Mark did to try to get the Titans back together, Caroline and Kitty were still not on board until Eden convinced them to do so. So again, I personally would give Eden more of the credit for that than Mark. And beyond that, again, he had people willing to go to rocks for him. Again, at that vote, at the final 12, all the Titans except for Jaden, who had immunity, were essentially ready to go to rocks in that situation, which is actually pretty insane. Now, again, there definitely are holes to be had in his game, particularly the fact that, again, supposedly he was looked at as very schemy out there and was looked at as a threat from the likes of Ferris and Eileen. He didn't manage his relationship with Jaden particularly well. And again, there definitely are holes to be had with his game. I think just in terms of how he maneuvered through the game, I do agree with most decisions he made. I do agree with where he ended up voting in the game. And again, had the vote against Raymond went off at the final 12 there, I think he would have been in a very strong position in the original Titans tribe. So again, he's essentially in the center of that power structure, to where again, I do feel like Eden plays a pretty optimal game despite coming in 12th place, where because that for me on this player ranking, he's pretty high here at number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to a player that until the point where Eden goes home, I would say that I think this person played a worse game than Eden. Much worse, actually. However, this person makes it very close to the end in a position where they probably were one challenge away from winning the game, and that player is Mark. And Mark is such a weird player on this season to me in the sense that I think he is a good player. I think he is a player that if you were to put him on multiple seasons, he would play the game very well. I think he knows the game very well. He seems to be pretty good socially. He was not a slouch physically to where he would be a target early on. Like, I think he is a very solid player. Yeah, I think his game on this season is very sloppy. I think his game on this season is one where, again, like he starts off the game very well. He is in the center of the original Titans tribe, even better positioned than the likes of Eden, to where, again, he does have the middle-aged Mafia. He is part of the Invisible Hand, but he also has the connection to the two Vs, while also having connections to Winna, and really ends up being the center of the Titans power structure, while also having an idol at that point in the game as well. Like, he is extremely well positioned on the original Titans tribe. And to be fair, again, I think his position gets kind of harmed by the fact that they swap following that, to where he gets separated from some of his allies, and it ends up giving the middle-aged Mafia more power in the game, in a position where he was ready to flip on them, though I think the fact that he was ready to flip on them is even questionable in itself. But still, we get to the swap where, again, I think his game just completely crumbles. I think he plays the game terribly at that point, where after Viola goes, all we need to do is get back with the middle-aged Mafia, and he would have been set to the merge, yet instead he decides to target them and tries to sloppily put together this plan to blindside Caroline and Kitty at the last second that doesn't go through because he doesn't put much of the legwork up to that point to make that vote go through. Now again, he is able to still survive to the merge and still survive a couple votes after that despite some sloppy play. And to be fair, I think a lot of that is due to his relationship with Eden. I do think his relationship with Eden very much helped him in the game at that point, which I do think you still credit him for. So again, once we get to the merge, again, he does seem to lead the vote against Kitty, which did seem like it was going to go through until the vote gets stopped. Though following that, again, loses Winna, is on the outs during that vote. Again, the following round, he gets a lot of credit for putting together the Titans, though really, I feel like he's part of the reason why that vote doesn't go through. Again, he kind of makes it too obvious that the Titans have gotten back together, which allows the Rebels to get together and put the votes onto Eden, which makes them lose out on that vote. Though again, just getting back together with the likes of Caroline and Kitty and working with them following that is actually still some decent play from him, as again, there are many players that just wouldn't have even bothered at that point. And to be fair, I will also give him a lot of credit for the Jaden vote. I think that's a move that is seemingly solely on Mark, to where, well, Alex was the one to get the information from Raymond that he would have been willing to flip. We do see Mark actually be the one to pull over Raymond at Tribal and get that vote to go through. Though following that, again, like we see him be on the outs during the Alex vote. We see him kind of just scraping by in the game at that point, barely surviving over Kitty and being the main target for the majority for the next few rounds, only to win the next few immunity challenges. Though obviously the game plays out in his favor, where Kirby gets taken out at 5, which again, I will give him some credit for in making the deal with Ferris that makes Ferris feel comfortable enough to make that vote go through. Also, we have Caroline winning the Final 4 challenge, which allows for him to get into a very optimal Final 3 situation for him at that point, of getting to the end with him and Caroline, who would have taken each other, to which he probably would have beat Caroline. And even against Ferris, I think he would have at least had a shot. Like the votes would have been split. Though to be fair, again, Ferris was never taking him, and that is obviously the situation he was in, is that he needed to make sure him or Caroline won final immunity. Though obviously they did have the better odds there, but again, that is something that definitely prop up Mark's game. Again, like for me, Mark is just this conflicting player in the fact that I feel like the first phase of his game is very, very strong, but then once we get to swap, it's a complete disaster, and he has a very, very rocky merge, though again, with some sprinkles of good moves here and there, with him, again, getting the Titans back together, him getting Jaden out, him having really strong odds at the very end of potentially winning the game, though it's still a very messy game, though, one that just isn't very consistent, and really his game should have been completely sunk at the swap, with him just playing that portion of the game so terribly, to where again, for me, I struggle with putting him much higher here in number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a player that I think you could definitely argue with Mark. I think this is a player that has some pros, has some cons in comparison to him, though for me, I do look at this person's game as a little bit stronger, and that person is Caroline. And again, Caroline is a tough player to assess in the fact that obviously she loses the game at the end. She loses in a 9-0 vote. I think she probably loses against most people at the end. I do feel like she's someone that didn't have much respect from the jury, and through that would very much struggle to win in any situation. However, I think her game is actually not that bad. Like the way she navigated through the game is actually pretty impressive for the first half of the game. Again, she was pretty much in control of both of her tribes in the pre-merge phase of the game. Now, I will say again, like I do think she gets pretty fortunate in the fact that the swap happened when it did. I do think if it had not happened, Mark and the V's would have had the numbers to take a shot at Caroline, though obviously that never really came to be. And beyond that, again, she just remains in control throughout the entire pre-merge phase of the game, having the middle-aged mafia, having connections to Rianna and Sarah. That allows her to pull off the Viola boot, which is a very good play there. Though obviously, again, by the time of the merge, she would have been on the outs at the Kitty vote, though that didn't go through. Then ends up working with Ferris to take out Winna, which is a pretty good move there. Though I think that's where her game starts to unravel a bit. Where again, I think after that, her game just becomes very inconsistent. I think she's starting to make some moves that are not really in her best interest, and really just feels like she's kind of going along with whatever her group is doing. Almost going to rocks at the Eden vote is pretty insane, and the fact that she even flips against Ferris at that point, I think is a pretty bad move. It's one that is just kind of unnecessary and just burns trust with him, considering the fact that she's doing so for Mark and Valeria, while she ends up being in the majority for the Jaden vote. I think it is also a knock the fact that she wasn't even able to keep her closest ally in line, and Kitty having flipped over at that point, which is pretty insane. You have her failed final 6 move, which is obviously really bad, just a terrible look for the jury, and obviously shows her mystery in the game, and the fact that her closest ally goes home while she plays an idol for her biggest enemy. Though I think the rest of her game again is also still very solid. I think the fact that she was able to be in on a lot of the mid-merge votes, despite not really being well ingrained in the majority, I think it's still definitely a pro for her. And the fact that she's involved in voting out Alex and Rianna, the fact that she regroups with Mark in the end game and takes out Kirby. Now, obviously, she does need a fire-making challenge at 4, though, again, I think she plays that round pretty well. And the fact that she ends up voting for Raymond, someone that she knows she can beat in the fire-making challenge. And through that comes into the final 3 in a situation where both people are taking her, though obviously the struggle there is the fact that she doesn't win against anybody. To where obviously Caroline did seem to struggle socially in the game. She didn't really seem to gel with a lot of the people not in her core group, which is definitely an issue there. And definitely had this perception issue of people just not thinking she did much in the game. Despite the fact, again, I think she played it very good first half of the game, and her navigation during the mid-merge portion of the game is actually still pretty solid, though it is still a very rocky game, and one that I do feel like, considering her lack of win equity, I think it becomes a debate between her and Mark, to where, again, Mark was a bigger target in the game. Mark made more active mistakes and was in a terrible spot for more of the game, but obviously had more win equity, which again makes them very close. Again, I personally respect Caroline's game a bit more than Mark's, even though I can understand why people would look at it the other way. But again, for me, I have Caroline above him here at number 3. Now number 2, and obviously the top 2 end up being who you'd kind of assume, considering how focused the season was on these two, though also considering the result, not surprising that at number 2, I do have Kirby. And Kirby is an interesting player here in that for a lot of the season, I kept on talking about how I think Kirby is probably the best player on this season. Now, I don't think she's necessarily playing the greatest game, but I do think she's a player that put her on any season of Australian Survivor. I think she does extremely well. I think she is very gifted at the game, though, considering the fact that she is not a fan of the show, didn't know much about the show, she picked up on the game extremely fast. Seemed to have this natural charisma that people just loved her while out there, while also being, again, pretty physical, to where I don't think she'll be an early boot on most seasons, to where, again, like, I think she's just a consistently all-around solid player. However, she's a bit of a mess strategically. And to be fair, I think she does learn as time goes on, where again, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that she didn't know the game particularly well. Where while she was in the best position at the very beginning of the game, her move to vote with the Cuddle Crew is astronomically bad for her game, burning trust with Ferris and Garrick, while also just furthering the lie to the Cuddle Crew, which ends up burning her relationship with Alex when she eventually does fully flip on them the following round. And it's a move that I think fully damages her game from that point forward. Though again, she is very well positioned early on and does seem to be in the center of the tribe, though again, by the time of what ended up being the non-elimination episode 5, again, she would have been on the outs. Again, the plan was to vote out Rianna, and she would have been down in numbers, so that would have been a major knock against her game. Obviously, ends up being a non-elim that saves her. Or again, like that entire situation of her targeting Ferris that early in the game just seemed ridiculous and unnecessary, causing this big divide between the two that lasts throughout the rest of the pre-merge, to where we obviously see them swap. And to fair, again, she wins the battle in that situation over Ferris, where she picks up the Titans, building this really strong bond with Valeria, and that ends up winning the day at the Garrick vote. It still ends up being in danger there, to where had Ferris used his idol on Garrick, which his entire alliance was telling him to, she would have gone home in that spot. Obviously, she loses control at the Charles vote, though obviously that was due to a twist, and even then it actually kind of worked out to her favor, as Charles was someone that wasn't really seeming like a long-term ally for her anyway. But and we do get to the Kelly boot round, which I do find pretty questionable play. Like, again, I do agree with the sentiment of getting rid of Kelly before the merge, if she's an unreliable number, and who knows what she's going to do at the merge. However, I think in that stand, I think considering the dynamics on that tribe, I just think it's very difficult to trust Ferris. And while, again, it ends up working out for her, and it does turn out that Ferris was willing to work with her at that point in the game, I think it's a very questionable move to even putting that trust in Ferris at that point, where, again, the entire vote against Kelly is very determined on Ferris not flipping on you, as you're essentially just giving your biggest enemy the opportunity to snipe you out of the game in that spot. But anyway, her post-merge is kind of rocky early on. Again, it's a situation where she doesn't really seem to be actively playing the game that much. She seems to just be following along with what others want to do, where, again, she was involved in the kitty vote plan, though wasn't an orchestrator of it. She was on the outs during the winner vote and didn't really seem to know what was going on during the Eden boot round until the very last second, to where the rebels end up coming together. Obviously, after that, she does make her big move in voting out Eileen, which again is a move I very much agree with. I think that is the right move for her game, and ends up working alongside Ferris from that point forward. And ends up like pulling in Jaden as a number, which is pretty good play as well. Though I think an issue though is that she does become too big of a target. Obviously, Alex ends up calling her out as a target, to where at that point she essentially needs to win out. And really, again, like I think in comparison to the number one person that we'll later talk about, I feel like that is a major knock for me for Kirby here, and that her positioning in the end game is just simply not that strong. It's simply one where she's being kept around by Ferris, with her being a blatant shield for him, but no one really wanting to go to the end with her where she needed to win out to get there. And even in that path, again, she's on the outs during the Rianna vote. And had she not won immunity in that spot, she definitely could have been in danger. So again, I think her game is just a bit inconsistent. Again, it's a game where she is just such a big target by the end where no one wanted to take her to the end. She tried to openly play the middle very early on, though I think her mid game is pretty strong. And I think she really does run the show alongside Ferris for a decent chunk of the merge, though at the same time, I think Ferris ended up being the one that was actually the best position in the game, where Kirby never really had a true path to the end unless she won out. Through all, I do think she has a lot of winning prospects and definitely does have some, again, very impressive aspects to her game. To me, it ends up not being particularly close between the top two, to where, again, for me, Kirby's here number 2. Now, number 1, the number 1 player from Australian Survivor Titans vs. Rebels is not very close. It is Ferris. And to be fair, I mean, like, considering where I thought Ferris was coming into finale week, I did think it was going to be close between him and Kirby. I did not think Ferris was going to win coming into finale week. I thought he was just too big of a target on the board while also being too prominent in the edit for him to go on to win. Though, again, I was proven wrong, and Ferris ends up playing a pretty impressive game here. Again, like, for him to actually get to the end in a situation where he somehow is unscathed until the final 3 is pretty insane. Where I think his threat management throughout this entire season is extremely impressive, to where, despite him seeming to be a jury threat, again, I don't think he beats Kirby, but he does seem to beat a lot of other people. Again, I don't know against Mark. I think that's a bit of a debate, though. Still, it's not like he was a GOAT in the game. It's not like people talked about him as if he had no shot at winning. To where, outside of some offhand mentions by Alex and Valeria, we do get constant talk about how he's a threat in the game, particularly from Caroline and Mark, though somehow he still gets to the final 3, which is insane. And his game as a whole is still a little bit inconsistent. Though I think in retrospect now having a grander view of his game on this season, I think it's better than what I thought it was going to be before we got to this final week, where again, like, his early game is strong. I mean, again, like, he is a part of the initial majority. He's one of the leaders in getting the votes onto Peta. That's all very impressive play. Now, obviously, he does end up wasting an idol, and his relationship with Alex is a very rocky one, where he does become a target in episode 4, and does just, in general, have this aura around him of people just thinking that he's a schemy player, even though he's not really that deceptive of a player, especially early on, though that does seem to paint a target on his back. But again, he does seem to win the day against Kirby, to where while Kirby wants to target him in episode 5, he does seem to actually organize the numbers against Rianna. So it did seem like he was actually in charge of that try by the time the swap. It obviously gets swapped, and in that position, ends up losing the battle against Kirby in picking up the Titans, where he obviously ends up losing Garrick in a position where everyone told him to play his idol, which, again, like, I've talked about that in my review. I don't even know if playing his idol in that situation is the optimal move. Obviously, he ends up using the idol to much greater effect moving forward, using it as a tool to keep the votes off of him, which again ends up benefiting him and keeping his idol around, as keeping Garrick around would not have been enough to get them the numbers. Though, to be fair, if you take out Kirby with that move, maybe Scott and Kelly end up flipping back to you, but still, I don't disagree with the choice to not play his idol in that spot. Now, again, episode 10 is very wonky, to where while I think he gets lucked out by a twist in that position, allowing him to keep his ally and Eileen in the game, I do think it also has some pretty decent play from him, and the fact that he does end up organizing the split vote plan on Winna and Charles ends up winning them the day there. Now, again, I do qualm with the Kelly move plan, the fact that, like Kirby, again, it's a situation where you have to put trust into Kirby, who he had been working directly against in the game, to where the optimal move there would have been to make a move against Kirby in that spot, though obviously considering the fact that they repair their relationship down the road, it ends up working out for him. But again, like, once we get to the merge, again, he seems to be involved in the kitty vote, though not a major orchestrator of it, but following that, again, he seems to be a major orchestrator of the Winna vote, where that seems to be a vote that comes through because he wants it to, and he seems to be the sole person to put the vote onto Winna himself, to where, again, that's very impressive. He also, again, has the read alongside Kirby that the Titans are back together, and ends up organizing the votes against Eden at the last second that wins the day there. He does get blindsided to Eileen and Jaden votes, though neither of those situations were directly moves against him, where it felt like the Eileen move was a move made by Kirby to get closer to Ferris, while the Jaden vote was one that, again, Raymond just made because he wanted to have a move on his resume. You'll find that, again, he's involved in the Valeria vote plan, helps Raymond get that through. He then proceeds to keep Kirby around as a shield in the game, where Kirby becomes this much bigger target in the game than him, though, and I think it's part of his expert threat management in the game at this point, and him keeping her around, taking out the likes of Alex and Rianna and Kitty. Now, again, I do kind of qualm with this move to take out Kirby at 5, to where, again, it works out for him, though I still think I personally would have kept her around and taken her out at 4. Now, again, I get the rationale for it. And again, he obviously needs Kirby out eventually anyway. And again, especially when it's this binary choice between Kirby and Caroline, keeping Caroline around as a secondary final 2 option that you can beat at the end, I think is also something that's beneficial as well, especially considering Ferris is someone that is confident in his fire making skills. And even in that spot, I don't think they necessarily knew for sure it was a final 2, to where, again, I do understand the move, and I do think in retrospect it's definitely a move that is very, very tough, though it's one that I did criticize at the time. But again, he obviously loses Raymond at 4, though again, does put in good work in building these final 3 deals with Mark and Caroline, though to be fair, it feels like the main reason he doesn't get the votes on him is because of his fire making ability more so than those deals. But again, he does do those. We obviously see his fake idol plan at the final 5, which is a very innovative move. For just in general, the way he uses the idols on this season is very impressive. Now again, I don't love that he gets into a final 3 situation where he needs to win immunity to get to the end. I think that's definitely not ideal, though to be fair, again, that is largely a situation where he actively made that choice to go into that position. It's not like he stumbled into that position. Like, he actively cut Kirby knowing that that was the position he was going to be in. So again, it was more so a calculated risk, and even beyond that, he still had other outs through Raymond potentially winning fire making, which would have put him in a very good spot. And obviously gets very unfortunate the fact that Raymond doesn't win fire making, and obviously just demolishes Caroline at the jury vote, to where, while again, I don't particularly love his final trial performance, I do think he easily wins that scenario, to where, again, Ferris, I think, plays a very, very impressive game. I think now that the dust is settled and we could kind of look at his game from a more grander view, I do look at Ferris as a very impressive winner on this season. I mean, while again, I do think there is some rocky play early on, and obviously he is in the minority in the post-swap phase of the game, I do think his post-merge game, despite being on the outs of a couple votes, is extremely impressive, and even has some pretty impressive maneuvers in the pre-merge phase of the game, to where, again, while again, I have qualms with certain moves he made on this season, he does end up becoming a very impressive player by the end of it, to where he's very clearly number 1 pick for this list. To where, I mean, there we go. I mean, that is the player ranking for Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels. Now, moving forward, obviously, I have a lot of other shows going on I'm doing videos for. We got Survivor 46, we got BBK 12, we got Challenge All-Stars coming up, Amazing Races happening. Still expect coverage of those things down the road. We also have the typical content that I end up making, where I will be making some more Australian Survivor videos in between this and the next season, where I'm probably going to make a penultimate juror ranking. I'm going to do the who would I vote for. And with next season being season 10, following that, I do also have another massive ranking plan for following that season. Though obviously that'll be a bit down the road, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the end of my coverage of Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels. Thank you for watching.